making.
So what we've been trying to do for you through the course of this special broadcast, which started at 8 p.m. Indian Standard Time, is an overview of what happened through the course of the 2 days that the G20 summit was on, through the summit itself and on the sidelines as well. Let's bring in our guest as well, who's now joining us, Professor Harshvardhan Pant, Vice President of the Observer Research Foundation. Good evening to you as well, Professor Pant. In terms of how these 2 days have gone by, there are a lot of things that stand out, but in terms of putting India across as a nation that has led the world in a certain direction which promotes its own worldview, how do you see these developments?
For a long time, India, there were question marks by the external stakeholders about the willingness and the ability of India to lead. And I think with this summit, India has shown that it can not only do mega diplomacy at this scale very effectively, but it can also lead and shape the global governance agenda. And I think that in some ways is the highlight of the summit, that now India is firmly embedded in the global governance structures of this international order. And as we are looking at a very transformative moment in this world order, India's voice, which it is trying to sync with the larger voice from the global south, becomes the primary medium through which the aspirations, the hopes, and the interests of a large part of the developing world are projected onto the global stage becomes very evident. And I thought in some ways the last 2 days were a reflection of that reality as to how the world is changing, how the world order is evolving, how we find ourselves today in the midst of a big flux where new stakeholders are joining this conversation. The sheer fact that the entire agenda of the G20 was framed around the global south, and that African Union, entered the G20, making it G21, and effectively changing the very character of G20. It is no longer simply the most prosperous nations on the world. It is also today reflective of the wider aspirations of the developing world. So in that sense, I think India has led this process through the last few months, which culminated in the Delhi Declaration. And India has led it very effectively in shaping what perhaps are going to be the key determinants of the global governance architecture going forward. So I thought in that context, the big picture is pretty clear, pretty obvious. And one hopes that as the despondency about the existing multilateral institutions continues to be with us for a while, perhaps the optimism of this G20 can percolate down to those institutions and perhaps make them more dynamic and more representative of the kind of world that we live in today.
Indeed. Ambassador Kumar, I want you to dwell a bit more, if you will, on something that you said in your earlier intervention. You described the India, West Asia, Europe economic corridor as an alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative. In that context, I'd like you to give our viewers some context here in terms of what we heard from the Italian Prime Minister here in New Delhi on the margins of the G20 summit. Italy, hinting in so many words that Rome will pull out of the Chinese BRI. The deadline is December this year, and the indications are Italy will become the first and the only G7 country, in fact, to pull out of the Chinese BRI. What does that tell you about Italy and the G7 vis-a-vis China?
No, I think it's very obvious that Europe is disenchanted with China, to put it mildly. And all of this happened, I think, immediately after COVID. You will recall that China was initially praised in Italy, and then gradually there has been so much of disillusionment. And this has now reached its apogee, if you like, where I think people are saying we don't want to be part of it. I think what you are seeing in the world is really two kinds of values and visions, if you like, both for infrastructure, supply chains, critical minerals, just even trade. So some fragmentation of the world, despite the rhetoric, is inevitable. I think there is going to be fragmentation. And I think China is at the center of it, is at the heart of it. There is no getting away from it. I've talked to Chinese analysts who readily concede that the Belt and Road Initiative can be accused of strategic overextension. The initial vision of Belt and Road Initiative was to take it up to Latin America, and that is now fallen by the wayside. But I think, secondly, some of the negative examples that you see of BRI, whether it is Italy getting out or Kenya, Hambantota, Ghana, I think these are not exactly been, these have not been good advertisements for China. That's the second issue. The third issue, of course, is a perception problem, frankly. They have a huge perception problem now where there is a large degree of unpredictability in China in terms of business, in terms of doing trade. You just don't have security and predictability. So those all, I think all these things have come together. With regard to Italy getting out of BRI, I think it was a lot of it was in the making, frankly. So it is not a great surprise anymore. But what is perhaps now happening is that you will find a set of countries, and I said, as I made my point earlier, what actually, if you look at the declaration, I would make 2 points. One, a number of the initiatives that India has pushed is actually to provide an alternative to China. So when we want, for example, reform of the multilateral development banks, you want World Bank and IMF to have greater ability to lend for poorer countries, both for sustainable development goals and climate change. That is largely in contrast to Chinese lending, frankly. So because so far, the World Bank has not been able to fulfill the demand of the lower income countries or the developing countries. So China has had a head start. So I think that is one thing that is being sought to be done. The second point, expanding on Professor Harsh Pant's point, is I would put it like this. I think so far India has been a rule taker. We have accepted rules which have been set by others because we have had no choice. And whether it is trade and whether it is supply chains, for example, the global value chains, we were not able to get onto it. I think for the first time, when I look at this declaration, I see an Indian attempt at shaping rules for tomorrow. So, for example, there is a Goa roadmap of tourism in the declaration. There is an encasing Lawrence Summers committee which has got a roadmap for the reform of the multilateral development banks. A Jaipur call for action when it comes to small and medium enterprises. A Deccan high principles, for example, in the area of food security and agriculture. There is a high life principles for life, which is, the Prime Minister's initiative of environment. And there is a voluntary principles of green hydrogen. So all of these areas, especially the cutting edge areas of climate change, hydrogen, food security, and even tourism, even small enterprises, I think we are trying to shape rules in these areas. Can we set norms and can we set rules in these areas? Because so far, Indian diplomacy has been largely a rule taker. Rules are formulated elsewhere. We may or may not participate in it. For example, I can speak with authority on the WTO, which is a rule-making organization. But if you ask me very frankly what India did in the Uruguay round, we merely resisted the formation of rules and eventually accepted it. We did not create our own rules, or we did not put forward proposals for new standards and new rules. But I think now the time has come when India, I see incipient attempts. To be honest, one should not exaggerate it. I don't think we have reached a stage where we are able to say, okay, we did the rules in these areas.
Yes.
But I see incipient attempts by India. And allow me to make just one last point again on rule shaping. Digital public infrastructure. If we can do the One Future Alliance in digital public infrastructure and somehow set rules in this area, and India is supremely capable of doing it, then I think we would have made the transition from rule takers to rule shapers. And I think that is the basic vision. At least I see the beginning of a journey in this G20 declaration where we are trying to set the rules in some niche areas.
Well, to a certain extent, this G20 has been disruptive as well, in the sense how African Union has found a place in a grouping of nations which are considered rich. Then there's, of course, this corridor that has been agreed to, and even the biofuels alliance as well. And if I could again bring in Ambassador Mukul on this, in terms of those forces that would have an interest in the status quo, do you feel that this is something that would worry, say, a country like China?
Well, I think it is. These are very major achievements of the summit. The coming in of Africa, I think, has been agreed to by everyone because it is part of the global South, and there was a consensus. But what it addresses is a very acute Africa deficit, which has been in the G20 for the last 24 years. So in that sense, I think it is very important. With regard to the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, and as a person who has served 4 times in the Gulf and the Middle East, including in Saudi Arabia and UAE, I'm absolutely delighted that this has happened. But the fundamental point, I think, to understand here is that that India's relations with these countries has really changed. It has been a transformation of India's relations with Saudi Arabia, with UAE and other GCC countries and other Middle East countries, that we are now in a position to even propose a project, a mega project of that nature. Of course, this is just the beginning. As the UAE representative, we heard this afternoon say that there is a follow-up meeting to work out the project details, and then next year the funding. So obviously this is a great challenge going forward. But even to announce a project really took the relationship between these countries, and therein I think India's relations with Saudi Arabia, with UAE have really been transformed in the last 4 or 5 years, or in the last few years, if I can put it that way. And with regard to the global biofuels alliance that you referred to, I think that is something, again, very, very ambitious but futuristic. And I think, again, India has been able to put that on the agenda of the G20, and I think it'll need to be looked at. But again, these are very major developments, and what will be the implications of these mega projects, the GBA or the India-Middle East corridor, remains to be seen. But by themselves, the announcements have been major. The Africa thing, there is another interesting aspect to the AU getting into the G20. I've already heard some proposals or read some proposals that under the Brazilian presidency, they would try to bring in the group of Latin American and Caribbean countries would also seek. Now, in what way, whether that will happen, not happen, whether they'll come in as a permanent invitee or as a full member, remains to be seen. But I think the decision to get in African Union was seminal in the sense that it was the first time in 24 years that the G20 addressed this issue in a meaningful manner, and there has been an expansion, and in the process, the Africa deficit, which we have been speaking about for years, has been resolved.
Right. Professor Pant, I want to draw your attention to a leader who was conspicuous by his absence, and I'm referring here particularly to President Xi Jinping of China. What do you make of his absence from the summit? And generally, how would China be looking at the success of this year's G20 summit in New Delhi? As they say, Professor Pant, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. The Chinese leader, the premier, Li Qiang, has held a meeting with the UK Prime Minister on the margins of the summit here in Delhi. And the UK government has condemned or criticized Chinese actions when it comes to the UK-China relations. We've seen Italian Prime Minister hint that it will pull out of the Chinese BRI. How would Beijing be looking at the outcome from the G20 summit tonight as we speak?
See, Ramesh, I think Beijing, of course, would be looking at it a bit warily because India is almost proposing something which goes, which is countering Chinese approach to global politics in so many fundamental ways, and therefore from the very beginning, when we were hearing that Chinese were very obstructionist in the various tracks of G20, there was a sense that perhaps China is trying to scuttle the G20. And then when finally they agreed, I think it was very clear to the Chinese that look, the way India had framed the G20 agenda and the way the world, especially the G20 members, were rallying around India, including some very contending powers like the US on one side, European Union, and even Russia. Prime Minister talked to Vladimir Putin. Prime Minister Modi talked to Vladimir Putin directly just a few days before the G20 summit, and I think there was a sense that perhaps if China does not agree to the text, it might, as people have pointed out, be looked at as the spoiler. So certainly, I think there was pressure on China. Now, the reasons why the Chinese president was not here can be debated endlessly. Some people have talked about domestic issues. Some have talked about the US-China issue. Some have talked about India-China issue. But look, Ramesh, one thing which is very interesting in all what has happened in the last few days is that India comes out as a very confident, ambitious country that is forging partnerships far and wide and is crafting a foreign policy agenda that is not simply premised on its own interests, but is also dovetailed very well with the larger issues of the global south. So somewhere down the line, when you talk of connectivity, when you talk of digital partnerships, when you talk of inclusive growth, when you talk of inclusive globalization, I think a lot of these issues look very different from Beijing, because Beijing has articulated a very imperialist economic and political agenda sitting, as far as the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping is concerned. So certainly they would be looking at some of these issues very, very, with a degree of concern, because as you were discussing earlier, whether the India, Middle East, Europe initiative is a counter to BRI or not, what is happening in the G7, what is happening now, the India outreach to the global south has become very substantive, what it means for China's own outreach to the global south. I think all those issues, there is no getting away from the fact that multiple contending contestations are shaping global politics. In the past, we used to say this is all about China and the US. But I think now we are also getting a sense that somewhere down the line, this is also becoming a China versus India. That India is also now pushing back against China in ways that are very interesting in the realm of ideas, for example. The whole connectivity debate, the way India has framed that debate in terms of very different set of ideas that China brought to the table with BRI. So I think not simply in material terms, where certainly India can't compete dollar for dollar with the Chinese, but what it can do is shape partnerships. It is ahead in terms of partnerships. It can shape the rules of the game. It can create new norms, as Ambassador Kumar was speaking. And I think that's what India intended to do with the G20 process. And in some ways, it seems to have succeeded as of now. So I think it's going to be an interesting engagement with China going forward. How do they react? What happens to the border issue? What happens to some of the more contentious developments? And what happens to multiple other platforms where India and China sit together trying to figure out global governance? And I think this relationship has become much more fascinating after G20.
Oh, yes, definitely. And we will talk about the FOMO factor a bit more, because we have some interesting asides to mention over there. But for the moment, I'll